Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Reverend Lillian Daniel, author of a new book titled Defrocked, Good News from a Bad Pastor for a Better Church. Lillian is a nationally recognized preacher, teacher, and writer whose book, Tired of Apologizing for a Church I Don't Belong to, generated international conversation about the changing religious landscape. It continues the theme of her book, When Spiritual But Not Religious is Not Enough, about the growing number of people who claim none as their religious preference. Lillian has been featured in the New York Times and on PBS, and her writing has been described as biting, hilarious, pitch perfect, tender, and often stunningly beautiful. Her book, This Odd and Wondrous Calling, is taught in many seminaries. You can learn more about all Lillian's work at lilliandaniel.com. So Lillian, thanks so much for joining us, and many congratulations on all of your great work.
Thank you, and thanks for supporting religious writing.
Well, it's been my pleasure. So what else would you like folks to know about you besides, that brief little bio that I read?
Yeah, well, so my real job is not being a writer. I've always been a pastor, and I've been a pastor in the United Church of Christ at four different churches. My ministry has taken me from a church in New Haven, Connecticut, Cheshire, Connecticut, been in the suburbs of Chicago, Glen Ellen, Illinois, also most recently Dubuque, Iowa. And
Hmm.
I've usually been like a senior pastor of large churches. And then in 2022, I accepted a call and a new vocation to work at the denominational level. And so now I'm what you call a conference minister. So I'm the Michigan conference minister, and I'm entrusted with the care and oversight of our 140 UCC churches in the state of Michigan. So I do a different kind of ministry today.
Yeah, yeah, that's very cool. Well, good for you. Sounds like a promotion. So I hope that that's viewed that
Well,
way.
I don't, depends what day of the week.
Sure, sure. So before we talk about the new book, could you talk a little bit about the other books that you wrote because they were so impactful?
Oh, well, thank you. My first book was actually a book called Tell It Like It Is, Reclaiming the Practice of Testimony. And I think it's my most useful book
Mm.
um, and the lightest in sales. But it was a book about helping sort of your mainline Protestants or Catholics recover the practice of testimony, where members of the church would talk about their experience of God in the context of worship. And I think in some ways I'm always writing the same book, which is about the importance of telling our stories of the experience of God. So that was my first. And then I wrote This Odd and Wondrous Calling. And that was a book that came about because I was in ministry. And it just so happened in that time period, there were a lot of books coming out about how hard ministry was and about how difficult churches could be and what it took. And there were books coming out about people leaving the ministry. I remember Barbara Brown Taylor, one of my favorite writers and yours, but she had come out with a book called Leaving Church, which just the title of it, was sort of
Sure.
jarring. So
Yeah,
many pastors
yeah.
who who sort of clung to her writings like a lifeboat, when things were rough. And so in complaining about, gosh, wish there were other books about the ministry, people sort of challenged us and said, well, why don't you write one? And every minister thinks they have a book about the ministry, and they do, but publishers don't necessarily want that. But in this case, my co-author and I at the time, we kind of hit a good moment and wrote This Odd and Wondrous Calling, and we just wrote these ordinary stories about the ministry that were not overly romantic, I think, and it was also like when there was a positive book about the ministry, it was some megachurch pastor who was like, here's how my lovely wife and I grew our, 20,000 member church with the Lord's help. And so we were trying to write about stuff like the weirdness of shaking hands after church and the sort of unusual things people say to you after you've preached, or, how do you pray when you're leading worship or ministerial authority? And that book sort of took off. And what surprised me though was that it wasn't just ministers reading it, but it was lay people. And so I said, what made you read this book? And they would say, it was very touching. They would say, I love my pastor and I want to understand my
Mm,
pastor,
mm.
which I thought was really great. But I was like, I love my doctor and I don't read medical books, so what's really going on? Where are you actually reading the book? And what they said is, we like the way church is described here.
Mm,
Because so
mm.
often church in books is described like Christians are described as these sort of stupid sheep followers of some unethical, sleazy minister who's a charlatan and a hypocrite. And, the Christians in the movies are always like picketing with signs and being cruel and judgmental or hypocritical. And, we try to describe the church that I experience, and I think you do too, which is full of really interesting people with diverse opinions who think for themselves
Yeah.
and somehow, do this thing. So after that, I said, okay, I'm going to start writing books for normal people, not clergy, for civilians, if you will. And so the next two books I wrote, the spiritual but not religious book and the tired
Yeah.
of apologizing, I pitched them at that thoughtful person in the pews who may not have a master's degree in theology, but is asking the same deep questions. How do you make a case for Christian community when perhaps you don't believe that your eternal salvation depends on going to a particular kind of church?
Very cool. Good for
Yeah.
you. Good for Well, I know spiritual but not religious was really widely read. At least
Yeah, and
my
widely objected
perception.
to by many people. It
Well,
got me in some hot water, but people thought, because I had this sort of very over the top polemical little essay about the spiritual but not religious where, I create this scene where I'm sitting on an airplane and somebody is kind of boasting that they're spiritual but not religious as if they're unique and unusual. And I say, you're in the mainstream of American culture and we have this little back and forth, and it's an essay, right? But as always, religious people are very earnest, and there was a whole crew of sort of liberal pastors who thought that they were about to sweep in all the spiritual but not religious people, but I ruined it for them by being mean.
really.
Oh yeah, I got all kinds of heat for it. And interestingly, the actual spiritual but not religious people who saw that post and the book and stuff, they thought it was funny. They understood the humor and the sarcasm. It was the earnest pastors, some of whom
Mm.
were like, oh no, you've made them feel not special.
Wow. To me, it was uncovering a reality. I mean, it was the gist of it. And
Yeah.
it's better to confront a reality than to sweep it under the rug, right? So, I mean, anyway.
And now we understand. I mean, there's so much good research now
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
nuns, the NONES. And in my book, the last book, I started exploring the different reasons that people are spiritual but not religious because, of course, there are many reasons. And so some of them are angry at the church. Some of them have never experienced the church, and now the statistics really bear that out. And so, yeah, I had the four types of nuns, the no way, the never have, no longer, and not yet.
Hmm,
And
hmm, hmm.
that's kind of proved to be true in what we're seeing as the trends continue.
Cool, cool. Yeah, it was a groundbreaking book at the time, but it was foreshadowed the future. So let's talk about the new book. As I mentioned, the title is Defrocked. Good news from a bad pastor for a better church. So I guess the first thing we need to discuss is the first word in the title, defrocked. Um, and I am sure several of our listeners are not familiar with some of the background that caused
Mhm.
you to choose that title. Could you explain that a
Yeah,
little bit for folks?
yeah, it's a highly nuanced reason, so I chose the title Defrocked because I was defrocked. So it's honestly it's a true story about an experience that I went through, over a decade ago. So I had been a pastor in the suburbs of Chicago at a large church that was rapidly growing. I was writing these books that, you're referencing that were getting a lot of traction. And in some ways, looking back, I was the classic type A senior pastor of a large church heading for a midlife crisis,
Hmm.
overwork, um, didn't have a life outside of my church. Like if you asked me what my free time and hobbies and vacation time were spent on, it was writing books about the spiritual but not religious, which now I understand is really not a hobby and is work. But, and then I was just going through the stuff of life. I went through a divorce of a long marriage to a good person, and and it just didn't work. And that's always a source of grief and sadness. And, I was an empty nester and all the things that were happening. And so I kind of got through that period, and I was like a year and a half on the other side of that and the divorce. And I'd managed to stay in this large church, which a lot of times doesn't happen to pastors who go through a divorce. And I'd engaged in like a lot of self-reflection and work on myself, and things were good. And I'm leading a women's group, meeting, small group, and there's a registered letter delivered to me. And I say, oh, I'll open that after they leave, and then I open it, and it says that I'm on charges of sexual misconduct as a minister,
Mm,
breaking the ethics code, um, for something that happened, like a year and a half earlier.
mm.
And I, and thus began this bizarre sort of time in my life where I had spent my whole adult life really being a minister and had never not had that professional identity, that vocational, spiritual identity, all the things. And the way the system worked, I learned that day, it was on the Thursday before Palm Sunday, is that the process of the review, the ecclesiastical process, they were going to pull me out of the church immediately. And I was going to go through an investigation and all this. And I presumed that that would all take place and I would return and have some hard conversations with my church about it, maybe stay, maybe not. But instead it turned out into like almost a year of not being in the ministry, of essentially being defrocked, at the end of which I get refrocked. But this is the story of that sort of spiritual adventure.
Wow, wow. Well, from watching it sort of from afar, I kind of had the feeling like you were getting treated very unfairly. Um, how do you look back on it now?
I've really chosen not to dwell on that
Mm,
aspect in the book because the truth is I did something wrong. And in the book, I sort of, well, you can read the book and learn what it was and how it happened, etc. But I don't spend a lot of time on that. It's more a story that I think a lot of us can relate to, which is sort of a failure story or a loss story or a crisis. And I play with the idea of the Good Samaritan and what it feels like to be in the ditch. Because,
Yeah,
all
you use
my
that
life,
term. You use that term. Can you elaborate on why you chose that?
absolutely. So, when I was a kid learning about the Good Samaritan, the moral of the story was Lillian, go out and be a Good Samaritan. And we all wanted to be the Good Samaritan. And I can see why. I've dug into the scripture, and the Good Samaritan is a cool person. He has money. He has like Hilton points at the hotel. He can check this poor person in who was beaten and left for dead or, in the ditch. But part of the story of the Good Samaritan, as Jesus tells it, is that there's a man who's in the ditch and the people he expects to stop and help him, other religious leaders, other people, from the community, walk by. And then the one who does stop to help him is his enemy, which is this Samaritan, and helps him. And so when I went through this strange process, um, one of the things about the way these processes work across denominations now is that they are very much shrouded in secrecy. And there's good reasons for that to protect, a whistleblower or things like that. And there's also ways in which our systems swing back and forth on pendulums. And when I went through mine, the pendulum was swinging far to one side to compensate for the terrible failures of the church
Mm,
in handling sexual misconduct in the past or
mm,
any kind of abuse, right?
mhm,
So
mhm.
we were coming out of the Catholic sex abuse scandal, which also, by the way, was a Protestant one, and one that obviously affects all religious leadership. But the sins of the past of simply sweeping things under the rug or moving predators around were recognized. And so the pendulum was swinging way to the side of caution. And so in my case, I was dealt with as if I were a predator or a
Mm,
danger to other people, so
mm,
instantly removed.
mm.
And I knew the reasons for that. I understood it. What I didn't understand is it would take almost a year.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Goodness.
And of course I was, just it's important to say I was not a predator. I mean, I had made a mistake, but there was, you want that opportunity to find out, are there 10 people who are going to come forward and have a story to, there was nothing like that in my case. And so I kept thinking, oh, we'll reach that moment and then we will have a conversation. But the way the systems work, there's a lot of silencing and separation. And it ended up that I was never able to return to that church, not even to have a conversation
Wow. Wow.
of apology, of repentance, of reconciliation, none of that. I was plucked out for the process. Then I was suspended or defrocked, as you will, and the church obviously couldn't keep me on, but there was no goodbye. There
Mm,
was no
mm.
conversation. And the way the system worked, I was not allowed to speak about it for all that
Wow.
time. I had
Wow.
to sign all these papers and stuff, but other people could say whatever they wanted. And so it was this really interesting, surreal experience of living in a house 4 blocks from a church where I wasn't allowed to speak to any of the people in there, or I would violate the terms of this process, and watching the videos of all the services and reading the newsletters where I was being spoken about and just,
Mm,
you know, sort of going a little bit crazy at that time because of
mm.
that isolation.
Sure, sure. I can imagine. Um, so why did you choose to write a book about it now? I mean, that's not an
It's
easy thing to do.
it's really not. And a lot of my friends, particularly my clergy friends, think that I'm nuts to do it. I mean, they say this is sort of this shameful thing you went through, you came through it on the other side. People have forgotten about it or didn't know about it in the first place. Why would you stir this up? Um, and particularly interestingly, that now I'm in a role in the church where I would have a lot to do with these actual fitness reviews with our clergy, and I'm entrusted with the care of our clergy. And so um, people said, why would you even tell this story? But I'm both haunted by it and formed by it. And I've come to a place now, over a decade later, where I believe that that experience made me a different person, made me a different pastor. And in a sense, I graduated from a program no one wants to enroll in, ditch university. But I think of it like I got my diplomas behind me to, say, okay, I'm credentialed, but this experience is also part of my credentialing now. And as I started, I've been talking about it, thinking about it for a while. And when I do preach about it, the church members or the lay people are like, we want to hear more of that.
Mm, wow. Wow.
They are the ones who say, let me tell you my story. I was running my own business and then this happened. Or, I thought I had the perfect marriage and then this happened. Or whatever it is. And they want to talk about failure and they want their ministers to be real about failure.
I mean, one of the things that's changed dramatically in our society as I've aged is the need for authenticity, right? I mean, that is so appreciated now. And, as you said, who doesn't go through some type of trauma, right? I mean, so to have a role model of how to deal with that, is a good thing.
I mean, we love authenticity, and I think in the ways in which when we love something culturally too much, we can make an idol of it, or
Mm,
it can become a fake version of itself. I think there's a lot of fake authenticity being
mm,
peddled out there.
mm,
And a lot of like here in the Christian world, like in the testimony world, my life was this terrible, and then I accepted Jesus, and now it's this perfect,
mm, mm, mm.
And I think people want to swim in the gray areas a little more. And to me, that's what's interesting. And so in the story of, what I went through, um, I take the reader with me in the first chapters of the book. You're with me in the state of mind I was in heading into Palm Sunday,
Mm,
imagining my church is going to hear this report about me, and I don't know what it all it's going to say, and I'm suddenly out of the ministry. And so you go with me on this sort of roller coaster where my state of mind was not one of deep clarity and introspection. I'm freaking out, right? And I'm wondering, where does my theology and spirituality land in all this? And you go on that journey, and then as the chapters go on, you hear more from the Lillian today
mm,
that is looking back on that and saying, okay, here's what I can see now that I didn't
mm,
see that.
mm. How would you say that it changed you as a pastor? You kind of alluded to that.
Well, it was a public thing and then a public silencing, and to lose control of your own story
Mm,
is a very difficult thing, particularly for a pastor, but also for a writer. And I realized the value of telling your own story. So I said, in some ways, I'm always writing the same book. It's always about telling your story through the lens of faith, right? Um, and it changed me profoundly because the thing I always feared most happened. I mean, several of them happened, right? End of a marriage, loss of job, vocation, career, all these things, reputation. When you lose a thing you're so afraid of losing, the thing you say, oh, if that happened, I would die, and then you don't die, there is something powerful in that.
for sure.
And I mean, Jesus talks all about it. Sometimes you have to lose the
Resurrection.
thing, or you have to lose the thing in order to gain it.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I had to lose my vocation in order to regain it.
Mm, mm.
Um, and that
Wow.
did change me. I came back and I wasn't sure I wanted to be a minister again. I wanted to complete the process of the church. I was invested in that, even though at times, I describe this in the book, the process got really weird and seemed impossible. Because I think a lot of times these processes, they're driven by the anxiety of the institutional church, and they just kind of, it's as if they want the person to disappear or quit.
Mm, mm,
So to stay in a process, at that moment in time, it was it was hard to do. But yeah, I went through the process. I wanted to be faithful to the church and that, but I wasn't sure I wanted to be a minister again. And I thought, maybe I'm not good at this. But I ultimately came to a place where I said, I want to be a pastor again, but I have to do it differently.
mm, mm. Good for you. Good for you. So I've interviewed a lot of people that have dealt with other types of trauma, and their writing about it tends to be cathartic. Um, did you find it that way or just more difficult?
Okay, no, for me, writing is never cathartic. Writing is excruciatingly difficult and hard work. And
Wow.
I don't know why I do it. So, except that sometimes you have a truth that you're trying to get to. And for me, I think writing is my form of prayer. So 90% of what I write, nobody should have to read. It's my form of prayer. It's journaling. It might be cathartic. It might be an indulgence in my own ego. But then I see it on paper and I think, ooh, you look in the mirror and you read it and you say, is this really who I am? Let me keep going.
Hmm,
And so, I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words on this because that's how I survived it, was writing about it. And what I found was very little of that was edifying for others to read.
interesting.
Um, and editing that was excruciating because I had to go back and feel the things that
Yeah.
were painful,
Yeah.
or like read a version of myself that was a real jerk.
Hmm,
Like I'm reading,
hmm,
going, oh my gosh, you sound like such a whiny victim and
hmm,
you screwed up. Or in other cases, oh my gosh, you're so self-hating. You know,
hmm,
what's wrong with you?
hmm,
It's so yeah, it's hard work. And
hmm,
I only ended up doing it because as I kept playing with the story and talking to people, people said, this sparks something for us, and the church needs this.
hmm. Good, good. Well, um, so, after you went back into ministry again, how did the churches that you were pastoring treat you?
So, in a weird quirk of the system, right? The church that I was removed from, I never, like, they never actually were told what had happened and
Mm,
what I had gone
mm.
through really in an upfront way. But when I re-entered the ministry, and I sort of tell, it's a longer story in the book, but I end up deciding, convincing myself I'm meant to go to a different kind of a place, and I want to go to Iowa. And I think I had this very romantic notion that if I got out of big metro areas and type A suburbs, and lived among the sheep and the flowers and the Shetland ponies in my backyard, I would have this sort of spiritually beautiful existence in some rural place. Obviously I didn't know what I was talking about, but I am convinced that I have this call to Iowa, and I believe actually it was a call to this ministry. And in that case, the person in my role, the kind of bishop role in Iowa, the church that called me, he told them everything. He was a highly transparent, confident leader who believed in telling the truth and getting into the gray areas. And actually, so in our system, when you become a minister of a church, they have a search committee that picks you, but then you go and do like a candidating sermon and the congregation votes. And on the Sunday before I did that, this guy, this conference minister, he told that church everything. Told them, what I was charged of, what happened, this being suspended, that there was a program of growth, that I was back. So this new church that never met me knew more about my situation
Oh
than
my
the church
goodness.
I had served for 10 years. You
Wow.
know, and fortunately, I think I didn't realize he had done all that. I found it
Mm,
out
mm.
later after starting, and he sent me the sermon, and I was like, you told them all this? Like there was children in church and you went there, and you know, it was a real blessing though, and he was a
Mm,
model to me in
mm.
how to do this work with more honesty. And so the church kind of knew what they were getting. And like every church, that was just one piece of what they were interested in. What they were really concerned about was the body of Christ as they experienced it and where I would fit. And you know, later in when I did interview with them and stuff, I'd really worked on myself, and I was in the sort of the pendulum swung way over here on authenticity. And I was ready to tell everybody everything because I felt like silence was killing the church. And when the search committee interviewed me, I had included in my profile, your resume kind of papers, some stuff about this incident. And I wanted to write a lot about it. And the powers that be, the nomination said, no, just put like 2 sentences. And so I was like, so when I got to them in person, I was like, do you have any questions about that? And they were like, not really, but what would you like to say? And I
Mm.
start going on and on about it. And they were just like, kind of like this. And later, as we got to know each other, they would just make fun of me. And they said, oh my gosh, that was so awkward. Like, we were like, nobody is interested in this. Like, it's becoming an R-rated movie. Like, nobody wants to hear about this. Don't, that's yesterday's newspaper, and you did your time. And so people in the church are often just really generous and sort of straightforward about these things. I think it's the clergy who get really weird.
Mm, mm. Wow. Wow. That's I don't know, good and bad, I guess. But, so what would you most like people to take away from the book?
I mean, believe it or not, in some ways it's a call to the vocation of ministry, as weird as it may
Mm,
seem with that title. But we have a clergy shortage.
mm,
Everybody does, right? And our churches are struggling, and I don't need to rehearse all those details of decline with you, but in that reshuffling or turning upside down, there's always new life, right? And I honestly think we are going to see and hopefully recruit and encourage the vocation of the new kind of pastor who because of the decline of the church probably cannot count on the ministry as providing like an upper middle class professional income and existence like that of somebody who gets a master's degree in counseling or law or nursing, right? I mean, our institutions are just in a different place. And so I think the hope of the church is going to be to get experienced people with other experiences in life who are willing to try this weird thing called ministry. And part of doing that is to reset our imaginations about who a minister is
Mm.
and whether or not you have to be perfect and all those things. Um, and so in this story, I actually hope some people might find a vocation.
Interesting. Wow.
They
Good for
certainly
you.
might read it and say, I could do better than this person.
So, thanks for doing this. I mean, I'm so glad to see you where you are now, and be able to reflect on everything so effectively. So
Well,
thank you
thank
for
you.
that.
I appreciate it. I feel sort of liberated in it too. I mean, it's been long enough. It's so important in writing and particularly public writing and uh, that you don't tell your story too soon or before it's
Hmm.
cooked.
Hmm.
And part of it was even during that year, there were people who wanted me to write things and give a version of a story and say things. And I was unwilling to. There was something deep in me that said your story is your gift, it's not ransom, right? And so it's taken me a while to say, is this edifying? Is this worth sharing? Or would it just be self-indulgent? And you know, you you can drive yourself crazy with that as a writer
Hmm.
and a
Hmm.
reflective person, but at a certain point I thought, no, I want to take that risk and put it out there and to be honest and to say that there's hope in the gospel promises. You can lose a thing in order to gain it, and that you can be a minister in ways that are more life-giving, healthier maybe. Yeah.
I've heard many other people say the same thing in terms of the timing that you're describing, that you have to wait. You can't talk about things when it's still too current.
Right, right. And part of it as a writer, I know you're student of writing and teacher of it and all that, is that but you also don't want to just do it all from this omniscient, now I figured it all out point of view. So that is why, like, a lot of people, when they've read the early chapters, are kind of shocked and say, oh my gosh, this character who is is off the rails here. And I'm like, stay with me though, because that's part of the story too, is to follow the arc of, what we learn in situations like that.
Wow. So I know you're in the midst of launching a new book, which is very consuming, but I have to ask if you've got anything else planned down the road to put yourself through more pain for.
No, I don't seek out. So, I've done a lot of other kinds of writing in the last 10 years, more in the essay form and things like that. I write for our devotionals in the UCC and, in my work. Um, And no, I don't have, I think, a lot of authors are like, in my next project, I never feel like that. I feel like it's like childbirth where you're just gone through this excruciating pain and somebody's like, when's the next one? And you're like, never, ever, like never. So who knows? But I do find that when I do put a book out there that stirs up people's ideas and feelings, there's often another one that comes shortly afterwards, which is all the things I wish I had said in the first one. And so, or is shaped by the questions that people ask me, like, what about this? And did you consider that? So I imagine there will be maybe a refrocked sort of a book coming out down the road of the things I've learned from the people who read this one.
Wow, wow, good. That's good to hear. Many congratulations on doing this. I really appreciate it, and I know a lot of people will. So congratulations on making this happen, despite everything. So again, the title of the book is Defrocked, Good News from a Bad Pastor for a Better Church. And please check out Lillian's website, lilliandaniel.com. Lillian, thank you so much again.
Thank you. And by the way, for any clergy out there, if you're looking for a church, Michigan Conference at the UCC,
It's a great
fantastic place
place.
to be a pastor.
Awesome.